Y'all know what's crazy? I grew up thinking Everybody Hates Chris was one of the funniest sitcoms ever made. Then I became an adult who pays bills and goes to therapy regularly. And baby, this ain't just a comedy anymore. This is a child trying to survive his family one episode at a time. Okay, and as a kid, I thought Chris just had really bad luck. But as an adult, I found myself asking, why is Chris always carrying the emotional weight of this family? Now, before y'all start typing, here she go. Diagnosing TV characters, relax, okay? I'm not a psychologist, and fictional sitcom characters can't be clinically diagnosed through the TV screen. But what we can do is use this show as a conversation starter because the family dynamics that it portrays are very similar to patterns psychologists have been studying for decades. So today, I'm not making assumptions, but I do have some receipts for y'all. So let's get into it. What's up, everybody? It's your girl, Indescribable, aka Geraldine Lake, and I'm here to ruin one of your favorite sitcoms again. I know. I know, I'm sorry. But one of the reasons Everybody Hates Chris aged so well is because the jokes landed when we were kids. But the family dynamics hit real hard when we became adults. So suddenly, things we laughed at started making us a little uncomfortable. You start noticing that Chris seems to get blamed for everything. He gets questioned more. He gets corrected more. He seems to have to prove himself more. Meanwhile, Drew can practically walk into a room smiling and everybody just assumes the best, right? Drew was literally God's favorite and every problem somehow found its way straight to Chris. Now, to be fair, that's television. Sitcoms exaggerate personalities because exaggeration is funny. But here's what's interesting. Psychologists have long observed that children within the same household often have very different experiences of the exact same parents. Researchers studying family systems have found that parents don't always relate to each child in the same way. Temperament, birth order, stress expectations, and even unconscious biases can shape those relationships. In other words, two siblings can grow up under the same roof and still tell completely different stories about their childhood. That's why I always laugh when somebody says, well, we had the same parents. Because did you? Because one of y'all got hugged and the other one got told, stop all that crying before I give you something to cry about. And if you grew up in a black home, you probably heard that one every day. All right. Now, one thing that stands out to me watching Everybody Hates Chris now is how often obedience is expected without a true explanation. Chris asks a question. The answer is usually some version of, because I said so. And child, Black parents wore that phrase out. I thought because I said so had to be written somewhere in the Constitution. I just knew there had to be an amendment that said children are prohibited from asking follow-up questions.
I said what I said.
But here's where psychology gives us something to think about. Developmental psychologist Diana Baumrind spent years studying parenting styles and identified different approaches parents tend to use. One of those is called authoritarian parenting. That's a style characterized by high expectations, strict rules, and a strong emphasis on obedience, but relatively low responsiveness to a child's perspective or emotional needs. Notice what I didn't say. I didn't say discipline is bad, structure isn't bad, rules aren't bad. Kids absolutely need boundaries. The question psychologists ask is whether children are given warmth, guidance, and opportunities to develop independence alongside those boundaries. Research over several decades has consistently found that children generally thrive when parents combine clear expectations with emotional support. In other words, because I said so might end the conversation, but it doesn't necessarily teach the child why the rule exists. And if a child is only taught to obey authority, but never encouraged to think critically, solve problems, or respectfully ask questions, they may become very good at following instructions while struggling to trust their own judgment later in life. And let me tell you something, that does not just stay in childhood. You grow up, your boss sends an email that simply says, can we talk? Your whole nervous system starts acting like Rochelle just called your full government name from across the house, okay? Your heart starts racing. Your palms are sweating. You're apologizing before you even know what happened. That's because our brains learn from repeated experiences. When home feels unpredictable or criticism feels constant, your nervous system starts preparing for danger, even when there isn't any. That's why Everybody Hates Chris feels different now. As kids, we laughed because Chris was always in trouble. As adults, some of us started asking a different question. Why did he always expect to be? So let's talk about something that might make some people a little uncomfortable. whoopings. Now, before y'all start writing think pieces in my comments, okay, let me say this up front. This is not a conversation about whether or not your parents loved you, okay? Those are two totally separate conversations. Most parents genuinely love their children and are doing the best they can with what they were taught. The question isn't, did they love us? The question is, did the methods they used accomplish what they hoped they would? Because those are not the same thing. One of the funniest running jokes in Everybody Hates Chris is that Chris is constantly trying to avoid getting in trouble. He's always calculating. He's thinking 3 steps ahead. He's trying to explain himself before anyone even asks.
She left us to go get the baby. But then when she came back, she brought your chicken. So then this guy came to the door asking for the baby. He said his name was Mario and he was the baby's father. So then when he left, she came back and the baby wasn't here. So then she went to go get the baby back. Her mother came to the door looking for her and the baby. So then they had a big fight about where to live. She said she lived at Mario's house. Who is Mario? So then when she came back, she started braiding Tanya's hair. You got to watch the game. You guys came back. She's trying to make it look like everything was all peachy and fine. It's not.
As a kid, I thought he was just nervous. As an adult, I recognized something psychologists called hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is when your brain becomes so accustomed to anticipating conflict or danger that it stays on high alert, even when you're safe. It's common in people who grew up in unpredictable or highly stressful environments. Your nervous system starts scanning every room, every conversation, every facial expression, trying to figure out if something bad is about to happen. Some of y'all don't even realize you're doing it. Your boss sends, "Can you stop by my office?" and you've already planned your unemployment speech. Your partner says, "We need to talk," and suddenly you're replaying every decision you've ever made since kindergarten. Somebody sighs too loud and you're wondering if you accidentally offended them 3 weeks ago. That's not because you're dramatic. Sometimes it's because your brain learned that staying one step ahead helped you survive emotionally. Now, am I saying Chris has hypervigilance? No, he's a sitcom character. What I am saying is that the way he constantly anticipates getting blamed reminds me of patterns that researchers have observed in people who grow up feeling like mistakes carry enormous consequences. And here's something I didn't really appreciate until I got older. Fear and respect are not the same thing, okay? Some of us were taught that if your child fears you, they'll respect you. But psychology has spent decades separating those ideas. Now, fear can actually produce immediate obedience. If I know that touching the stove means instant consequences, I'm probably not going to touch the stove. But long-term respect is different. Respect grows from consistency, trust, safety, and knowing someone is trying to teach you, not just control you. That's one reason that researchers have found physical punishment may increase immediate compliance, but it's also associated with higher levels of aggression, anxiety, and other negative outcomes over time. That doesn't mean every child who got a whooping is traumatized. It doesn't mean that every parent who spanked their child was abusive. It means the overall body of research has become increasingly skeptical that physical punishment is the most effective way to teach emotional regulation or long-term decision making. I'm not telling you how to feel about your childhood. I'm telling you what the evidence says. Now, let me tell you what I find real fascinating about Everybody Hates Chris. Chris ain't just trying to avoid punishment. He's trying to manage everybody else's emotions. Watch how often he's explaining, apologizing, or trying to prevent someone from getting upset. That's something that family therapists often notice in homes where children feel responsible for maintaining the peace. Over time, some kids become little emotional managers.
I don't feel like your brother. I feel like a 13-year-old father.
They start monitoring everybody else's mood because they believe it's their job to keep the household calm. Whew, now, if that one hit you in your gut, don't click away just yet, okay? How many adults do you know who apologize for everything? Somebody bumps into them and they're the first one saying, "Oh, I'm sorry." They over-explain every text message. They can't say no without writing 5-paragraph essays. They feel guilty taking a day off. They assume everybody's disappointed in them. Sometimes those habits didn't appear out of thin air. Sometimes they began as survival strategies in childhood. One of the things I admire about Julius is that he often provides emotional balance in the family. He's practical. He's patient. He's funny without being cruel, but even that highlights an important truth. Children don't experience their parents separately. They experience the emotional climate created by the entire household. Every parent brings strengths. Every parent has blind spots. Family dynamics are almost always more complicated than one good parent and one bad parent. That's why I want us to be careful not to reduce this conversation to just villains and heroes. Real families aren't that simple. Most parents are carrying wounds from their own childhood that nobody ever helped them heal. Sometimes people parent the way they were parented because they genuinely believe I turned out fine. But here's my favorite question whenever somebody says that. Did you really turn out fine? And I don't mean sarcastically, I mean it sincerely. If you flinch every time somebody raises their voice, if you think disagreement automatically means rejection, if you've spent your entire adult life trying to earn love instead of simply receiving it, if you don't know how to rest because you only feel valuable when you're productive, that would be me. Maybe you survived, but surviving and healing are two very different things. And I think that's why Everybody Hates Chris still resonates all these years later. Underneath every joke is a kid who's just trying to figure out how to belong in his own family. And that is a lot less funny once you think about it after you've grown. Now here's where I think Everybody Hates Chris accidentally teaches one of the biggest lessons about family dynamics. Kids don't just learn rules from their parents, they learn who they're allowed to be. Think about it. If you're constantly told you're the responsible one, eventually you stop asking for help because responsible people aren't supposed to struggle. If you're always the bad kid, eventually you start expecting people to misunderstand you before they even get to know you. If you're the smart one, failure starts feeling like a threat to your identity. Labels have a funny way of becoming self-fulfilling. Psychologists call this the Pygmalion effect or the expectancy effect. In simple terms, the expectations people have of us can influence how we perform and even how we see ourselves. Children are especially sensitive to those expectations because they're still figuring out who they are. If a child repeatedly hears, "You're so difficult," or "You're always messing up," those messages can become part of the story that they tell themselves. Now, let me ask y'all something. How many times did you hear, "Why can't you be more like your cousin?" First of all, okay, why is my cousin catching strays? Leave Keisha out of this, all right? Keisha did not ask to be the family standard. And if Keisha is so doggone perfect, then let her come over here and wash these dishes. Yeah, go to hell. But seriously, comparison is a dangerous teacher. It doesn't inspire confidence. It often creates shame. And research on social comparison suggests that constantly measuring ourselves against other people can undermine self-esteem and increase anxiety, especially when those comparisons come from people whose approval really matters the most. That's another reason sibling relationships can become so complicated. A lot of brothers and sisters spend years believing they're competing with each other when the real issue is that the family unintentionally created a competition that never needed to exist. One child gets praised for being athletic. Another one gets praised for being attractive. Another one gets praised for making good grades. Before long, everybody feels like they have to earn their place instead of simply belonging. And here's the sad part about it. Sometimes siblings don't reconnect until they're adults because they finally realize we were never enemies. We were kids trying to survive the same environment in different ways. That realization changes everything. I also think it's important to say that because social media has a habit of swinging from one extreme to another, not every strict parent was emotionally unhealthy. Not every child who got a whooping grew up traumatized. Not every family that argued was dysfunctional. Human beings are way, way too complicated for those kinds of blanket statements. At the same time, we shouldn't dismiss people's experiences just because something was common. There was a time when smoking cigarettes indoors was common. That didn't make it healthy. There was a time when people thought children should be seen and not heard. Today we know that helping children express their emotions in healthy ways can support better emotional development. Sometimes culture changes because the evidence changes. One thing I appreciate about this conversation is that it gives us permission to ask a question that many of us were never allowed to ask growing up, which is why. Not to be disrespectful, not because we think we know everything, but because understanding creates wisdom. Blind obedience creates compliance, and those are not the same thing. I think that's one of the greatest gifts we can give this next generation because children don't need perfect parents. Perfect parents, they don't exist. They need parents who are willing to apologize when they're wrong, okay? Explain when they can, listen even when it's inconvenient, and create a home where respect goes both ways. Yes, children should respect their parents. I also believe parents should respect their children as human beings whose thoughts and feelings matter. And before somebody say, well, if you explain everything to kids, they're gonna run your house. That ain't what the research says, okay? Children can have structure and a voice. Those ideas are not enemies. In fact, children tend to do better when they understand the purpose behind the rules instead of simply fearing the consequences. That's why I don't watch Everybody Hates Chris the same way anymore. I mean, I still laugh because it's hilarious. Terry Crews and Tashina Arnold are literal comedic geniuses. The chemistry was insane. Tyler James Williams was incredible. Chris Rock's narration is iconic. The show deserves every bit of praise that it gets, but now I also see a sitcom outcome that accidentally started conversations that many families are still struggling to have to this day. Conversations about favoritism, about discipline, about emotional safety, about being heard, about how two children can grow up in the same house and remember it totally differently. Maybe that's why this show has lasted for so long. It gave us permission to laugh at things that we didn't yet have the language to fully understand. So I'm gonna leave you with a question. When you think back on your childhood, what lessons did your family intentionally teach you? And what lessons did you learn by accident? Because sometimes the most important things we carry into adulthood were never spoken out loud. They were just lived experiences. If this video made you think a little differently about Everybody Hates Chris, or even about your own childhood experiences, then let me know about it in the comments. And remember, the goal is not to blame our parents. The goal is simply to understand ourselves well enough that we don't pass on the parts of our pain that were never ours to carry. As always, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you know every single time your girl uploads, and I will catch y'all in the next video. Peace.